Thank you. It's because of so many of you and so many of my colleagues in Bangladesh who took those risks that I'm here today. Thank you very much. Yeah, let's have the presentation. And I say this because I think it's worthwhile pointing out that as an activist, one travels a complex route. One of the things that happened immediately after my release was that a lot of people approached me. They organized very kindly. They organized fellowships and other things for me so I could stay outside, live comfortably, continue to work outside the country. But that's not my work, where my work is. I belong in Bangladesh. It's there my struggle is, and I have to be there. And in order to be there, that's what I've done. I mean, I've been critical of every regime as and when it happened. When the military government was there, I had a loaded gun at my head. I was stabbed 8 times by the BNP government. The Army League government puts me in jail. It's a risk. And it's a risk one has to take in certain professions. But at the end of the day, I think while I blame successive regimes for doing what they do, I also need to turn my lens on foreign governments, the European Union, the US government, people who continue to work with pliant dictators because they find it convenient, because these dictators deliver on certain grounds, and therefore they will turn a blind eye to many things that happen because it's okay. Once we get what we need, we can overlook a few things. So it's not just up to me or my colleagues. I think it's up to all of us across the globe to stand up and ensure that our leaders are held to account, that they cannot get away with what they do. And I say this because, and I will go across it. So this picture is taken prior to 1971. We had a very bloody war, and I'll just show you something if I can. The woman over there, Sultana Kamal, went on to become leading human rights lawyer and is currently the chairperson of Transparency International. She went on to be an advisor to the caretaker government and is now on the board of our festival, Chobimala. And I'll come back to this later. So, yeah. This photograph was taken by a very famous photographer, Rashid Talukdar, taken on the 17th of December, 1971. We were independent on the 16th of December. The Pakistani army, before they left, decided they needed to destroy the country intellectually, and these were the people we found in the killing fields of Rare Bazaar, journalists, writers, poets who had been killed before they left. We have been colonized by the British, we were colonized by our own people, but we also recognize that democracy does not come from elections themselves, and certainly popular regimes, people who've led the War of Independence, as in my country, sometimes turn around and become repressive themselves. And one of the problems we have is that we remember that legacy, we remember what they did, and in the process sometimes overlook indiscretions at a future stage. That is something we cannot afford to do. Regardless of the past, regardless of the history, governments need to be accountable to the people, and they cannot shelter under what they might have done in the past. This is much more recent. In relative terms, this was after we had what we thought was democracy. So I left Bangladesh. We became independent in 1971. I left the country in 72, leaving behind what I thought was an independent nation. I went overseas to study. And when I came back 12 years later, I discovered my country was in the hands of a military dictator. It was as an activist in the streets that I began to do this type of work that I now do. But then we were able to bring this general down. We had a free and fair election. We had elected government. But that elected government behaved exactly in the same way as the previous governments did. And that's one of the things we need to deal with. This is much more recent. This was taken, this is a snapshot on the day I left Dhaka. And while you saw the earlier interview of Al Jazeera, this was an Al Jazeera report on the advisor to the Prime Minister, the security advisor to the Prime Minister, who was responsible for the disappearances of people who had dealings with his wife's company. Today, well, day before yesterday, my own Facebook page has been blocked in Bangladesh. It's visible here, but within Bangladesh, it's been blocked. And I've continued to do what I did then. I've continued to report. I've continued to comment. Therefore, my Facebook page and I myself continue to be a threat. One of the things that's worth remembering, our government has put a lot in store for development. The fact that the country is progressing, doing economically well. This is something we've heard before. We've heard it in China, we've heard it in Singapore, we've heard it in Malaysia, we're hearing it in Bangladesh. Let us have economic growth, human rights we can worry about later. But the nation that we have, it was built, the people who struggled to liberate my country were the ordinary farmers in the fields. They sacrificed, and they did it because they believed it would lead to a different life for them. Sadly, this development has not resulted in changes in their lives. It's the wealthy, the super wealthy in my country who have gone wealthier. They've sent their monies abroad. In the last 11 years, there have been over $83 billion sent overseas by Bangladeshis. It's not our farmers in the field, it's not the migrant workers, it's not our garment workers who've sent this money. They're the ones who send money back. So one of the things we tried to do was to look at how we might intervene in this political space. And we decided, okay, we were not going to be politicians in a situation where you need money and muscle to be politicians. We felt we could not do the politics we believed in. So we made another decision to work using the three pillars, media, education, and culture, to exert pressure on the political space so politicians could not get away with what they get away with. And so there were the agency DRIC, there was the agency DRIC, which we set up in '89, the School of Photography, Bachala, which we set up in '98, which is considered today to be perhaps one of the finest schools of photography in the world, and the festival, which we started in 2000, called Shobimala. So those three make up that. And I'm showing you a little clip. If you could go on. This is an excerpt of some of the past Shobimalas. The significance of Shobimala goes far beyond photography. It's about challenging certain stereotypes. It's about recognizing that a vast cultural difference exists, which is embedded within political differences. And what Shobimala tries to do is to address those political inequalities through culture. The very way it began was exciting. Right at the beginning, we had an abortive attempt in 1995, but when we really began in 2000, the first thing that happened was a closure. We were going to have this exhibition at the museum, and of course the government wanted to censor our show. Taking a show out of a museum is not quite so easy, particularly at midnight. But we opened at DRIC, and the very same people who were meant to open the show originally, our famous poet Shamsur Rahman, came and opened the show at DRIC. The government had egg on its face, had to explain why they shut the show down, but that was their problem. And we've continued ever since. Of course, we've worked with the government as well, but we've had this huge, wonderful range of photographers. There you see Reza
with his Lumix camera. We've gone back to the National Museum. We've had shows there. We've had shows in the major places all across Bangladesh. But of course, we've also taken the show out of museums, out of gallery spaces, to the public. We've had a phenomenal range of work. The greats like Salgado and Reza and Martin Parr and Raghu Rai have all showed, but also young emerging photographers, people who, in some cases, who actually made their mark through photography. This was, for many people, the first opportunity they ever had. And they've all gone, well, many of them have gone on to become superstars. We've dealt with bureaucracy, we've dealt with lack of resources, we've dealt with the problems of our own limitations, but that has never been something to stop us. The themes we used, things like resistance, boundaries, exclusion, were of course all themes to do with the social significance of our work, the type of work we wanted to present, the things we stood for. But it's evolved there as well, and we've taken shows to football fields, set them up in unusual places, but we've also engaged with the public in a very different way. We've involved the participants, we've involved a global public, we've involved the internet, we've used social media.
Chobi Mela is a very different event. It's not at all like other festivals. The time it was taking place, the streets of Dhaka was in flames. A political party was trying to hang on to power through means which the people considered illegal and unfair, and there were protests, there was violence in the streets. Our struggles include these political struggles that we're embedded in. To be able to perform within that spectrum, it's also evidence of DRIC's resilience that we were able to pull off a major international festival at a time when most things in Bangladesh were being switched off. The tap was being switched off.
I was present at the very first edition in the year 2000, and I have seen the festival grow and mature and become a very diverse and very rich and dense cultural event.
The arrangement of International Chobi Mela vouches for DRIC's urge to connect to the spirit of higher expression of the people the world over, which in turn connects all of us in the same movement to reveal our aspirations to attain a better, a higher.
So the reason I'm showing you this is to also tell you about how we've negotiated those spaces. Now, Chobi Mela became very important, and there was a time when we felt we needed to for the government to recognize that. So we invited the president to open the festival. And this is a picture of me talking to the president. So it's quite interesting, you know, you have the most severe critic of the government having this tete-a-tete with the president, and we've actually been able to balance that act. As you've realized, it's not always worked. The balancing act is a tough one. But at least at that particular point in time, the president did come and open the show. There are other benefits of getting the president to open the show. You get to write his speech. So I was able to draft a speech which, you know, on the face of it will look nice, but I smuggled in the words that I wanted him to say. And that we have on record. So And I say this because, you know, you need to maneuver in all these sort of situations. You need to find the gaps, you need to survive, but you also need to be effective. And that was quite interesting. Yes, please. But what we also did was to look at the vocabulary of the medium to see how that might work. You may well know about the Rana Plaza, the garment fire that took place in Bangladesh, and the buildings that fell down. One of my former students took that very iconic image of the embrace during the Rana Plaza disaster. What we decided to do was to turn it around. We knew that the fashion industry was very involved with the garment industry and that they used the billboard. So we took that picture, which is the carcass of the fire that had taken place in Tazreen Fashion, where so many workers had died, and we turned it into a billboard, and we put it up in front of the building at the back, which is the Garment Owners Association in Bangladesh. It's a 22-storied building that went up without anyone noticing it. It was built on a water body by filling it up, which in itself is illegal. One prime minister inaugurated the construction, one prime minister inaugurated the completion of the building, yet it never had building permission. But we decided we would intervene. So one of the things we did was we recorded the wailing of the survivors at Tazreen Fashion. We smuggled it into the building and played it in the building. So there was this sound of all this wailing, and people came out. We had a performance arranged outside, and then there was this billboard outside to greet them. Now, while I say all this, some of you might think that, you know, the government is not very receptive to the arts or doesn't give us attention. I want to dispel that. Our government gives us a lot of attention, as you will see from the next picture. So, you know, how many of you had reception like this to your art event? We get importance, yet they worry about how, despite all this attention, we're not appreciative. So let's go on. Now I'll come to something else. There is a woman here, I hope. Wasfia, are you here? Can you stand up, please? So Wasfia Nazreen is a person who was very influential in my release and campaigned for my release, but when they organized a protest in front of the United Nations, they did a whole lot of other things, and they felt they were not getting enough attention. So Wasfia arranged for this plane to circle the United Nations building so it could be seen. But I do also want to tell you about Wasfia herself. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have heard of Begum Rokeya? Non-Bangladeshis? No one. I'm not surprised, but this is a woman who's perhaps one of the greatest feminists who ever lived. She wrote very powerful literature over 100 years ago on not only on feminism, on science fiction. She, in her story Sultana's Dream, which she wrote in English, she talks about a country where women rule and men are in the kitchen. And all sorts of very, very interesting ideas, but you've never heard of it. You've never heard of Wasfia either. Apart from what she did here, she's also someone who's climbed the tallest mountains in 7 continents. That's a pretty special feat, yet you will not have heard of her, because stories like that about Bangladesh will not surface. The stories about Bangladesh that have largely been talked about have been produced to a large extent by white Western photographers parachuting in. And the type of stories they've done have generally been regurgitating stereotypes. And it is to challenge those stereotypes. It's to give a more rounded understanding of these countries, which I call majority world countries, that we did what we did and why Catchlight does what it does, which is why the work of Catchlight is so important, so that the other stories that are important do begin to surface, because there are other people telling the stories. There's a beautiful expression in Africa which goes something like, until the lions find their storytellers, stories about hunting will always glorify the hunter. And I think Catchlight and we at Rig provide opportunities for the lions to tell their stories. What was important for me was the fact that it was such a massive campaign for my release. So all of these people and many, many more signed on my behalf. I know some of them. Desmond Tutu and I had been a speaker in Norway before, and many of the others. But some people I have no connection with. I mean, Richard Branson, I don't know him from Adam. I don't even know him to be an activist, but he was one of the people, as were many others, who signed. And I'll show you this because we did the festival, and when we decided to do the festival, this is the 10th edition, I was in jail. And my colleagues and I, we decided we would have the festival anyway. We knew that there would be no funding. We knew that the venues normally available to us would not be available because they're mostly government venues. But we decided we would do it anyway. It was an act of defiance. We needed to have the festival then. One of the things that did happen, over the years, I had weaned Chobi Mela off international donors and relied much more on Bangladeshi donors because it was a Bangladeshi event and we felt we needed to take ownership of it. We had, over the years, something like 25 Bangladeshi donors. In the last Chobi Mela, which we did, which was the 10th, except for Nova Air at the top, no one else was prepared to come. It was just too dangerous to be Shahidul friendly. And I remember one CEO of a multinational company ringing me from a landline and saying, it's too risky to even answer your phone. So that's the situation we've operated in. Please. But as you may have seen in the film, we had shows on rickshaws, but we've done it on bullock carts, we've done it in boats. If people will not go to a gallery, the gallery will go to them. And that's the philosophy in which we've operated. We've ensured and insisted that our work does not stay confined to elitist spaces, but begins to engage with public in a bigger way. But I'm now going to show you a few pictures which have to do with the type of photography that we practice, what we talk about in my school. This photograph is taken by a student from the first batch of Patshala, GM Byakash. It's a photograph of a woman who breaks bricks. It's a very hard life. It's a difficult job. But you have surely seen pictures of the labor itself. But Akash wanted to tell a different story. He knew that when there was a break during work, this woman who broke bricks would see her little baby. Earlier on, we saw the picture of your baby. Now, for this woman, it was very important to kiss her baby during the break. And the photograph that he shows is this one, of a brick-breaking woman stealing a kiss. That is another way of telling the story. But that is a story that is very rarely told. And you will only see those stories, hear those stories, when people who are engaged with their community are able to tell those stories. This one is by Hassan Saifuddin Chondon, and the recent attack in New Zealand and a whole lot of other things talk about Islamophobia, which is such an issue today in the world. But I was looking at this picture, and the story that Hassan Saifuddin Chondon talks about is how within Islam, the relationship with God does not require an intermediary. It does not require a mosque. It does not require a priest. When it's time to pray, an open field is your mosque. That, again, is an image of Islam that is very rarely talked about. This is my parents. These are my parents. My dad teaching my mother to use email. She did resist for a while. But again, when do you see pictures of family life inside a home? When do you see something like this, which is part of everyday life? This is middle class. This is a home. This is one of many things that happen within our lives, and these are stories that are never told. And I'll show you two pictures here. This one of the things we started, and when I started teaching photography in my country, I joined a camera club, and camera clubs across the globe are pretty much the same. I mean, you don't have naked women by waterfalls in Iran, but otherwise it's rules of thirds and all that sort of thing. And they do the type of photography they do. And I tried to introduce documentary photography. There was initially resistance, but we managed to do a workshop about village life. And instead of having this show in the gallery in the city, we decided to have the show under a banyan tree in the village itself. There were several things that happened. There was one picture of a young man who'd passed away, and the picture we had on those walls was the only photograph that family ever had of that man. But while we were waiting for the show to open, some kids have gone up the tree, and of course the photographer, myself, has to go higher up the tree to take pictures of them. And while I'm doing this, I noticed that there's a little kid down below who's really badgering everyone because she has to get into the show first. And I was very curious, what's so important about this girl going to the show first? And let's go to it. So I came down and I asked her why. She says, my goat has to go and see the show. Why? Because he's in the show. Yeah. So as you can see, the goat's not very interested. But she's dragged that goat in to see this photographic exhibition where he's featured. Now I often wonder whether, had there been a poem or an essay about the goat, she would quite have been so insistent to drag the goat to read that poem or the essay. But that is the other aspect of photography. Not only is it as powerful as it is, but the average person relates to it in a very, very different way. They feel that photography speaks to them, that a goat can understand that language. Next one. So we developed other strategies as well. As I told you before, Sultana Kamal, who we saw in the very first picture and was later speaking as an advisor, is now on our board. But to get protection, to ensure that we could continue to do the sort of things we did, we formed an advisory board of a very, very high stature, the finest individuals in Bangladesh and people who still had the spine to stand up and be counted and speak and protest. We also invited neighboring people. So on the left is Kunda Dixit, one of the best-known journalists in the region. Then Professor Rehman Subhan, who's the most respected academic. The person after that is the sister of Dr. Nazish Ahmed, who we were giving a Lifetime Achievement Award to. Raghu Rai, the Magnum photographer, is lurking from the back. You won't know the person with the beard. But after that is Beth Citron, the curator of Rubin Museum, who are holding my retrospective in New York in November. Through things like this, we've demonstrated that we have strength as well. And we're not dependent upon the government's largesse to be able to do it. And we had this show knowing that we would be under-resourced. We had this show knowing that major venues would be unavailable to us. We had this show knowing our sponsors would have backed out. And we did it anyway. So I'll quickly go through some of these pictures. One of the things we did was we had an under-construction building, and we decided that would be our venue. But that gave us an independence we didn't really have before. It allowed us to be much more inventive than we'd been before. It allowed us to put nails in the wall, which no museum would allow us to do, and a whole lot of things. So let's go through these pictures. But we also do, we can go through them one by one. This one is interesting. That's the editor of Himal. And while we were having the festival, India and Pakistan were at the brink of war. So we made a statement for peace. That too is one of part of what we're about. Next one. We didn't have a big place, but as you can see, it's completely packed. The floor is packed. Some people are sitting on the dais. And Raghu Rai, on our board of advisors, is speaking. some of these pictures are in the under construction building. We can go through them one after another. Yeah? This is the lift shaft for our car park. There's no car park at the moment, and there's no lift at the moment, so we were able to inventively utilize the space. So those pictures are of Rohingya refugees, and we've created a water body underneath and sand. This sort of thing would be very difficult to do in a conventional museum. Yeah. Yeah, again, this is another lift shaft, the passenger lift shaft, and water had fallen down because we couldn't prevent the rainwater, so we decided to incorporate the water within the show. This is the machine room for the lift shaft, and since the machine isn't there, that too becomes exhibition space. The scaffolding that the workers were using, we put that to work. This is the external wall, and as you can see, the rods are still there. The walls haven't been built, but the texture works. We did do it in conventional spaces too. There were some partner organizations, and this is Dayanitha Singh's exhibition on books. And what we also did was we invited Arundhati Roy, the famous, very famous writer from India, to talk at the festival. Now, another thing we'd done was at the opening event of the festival, we had a discussion on freedom of speech and thought. And that we felt was a very, very important thing to do. Here is a festival whose director has just come out of jail for having spoken the truth. We do a festival, and the very first thing we do in the festival is to have a discussion on freedom of thought and expression. So we were insistent that we would not cow down. Our voice would not be curbed because of what the government had done, and that's how we did it. When we invited Arundhati, she's a superstar, so we needed a big place. Over 1,000 guests had to come. So we booked a place. The government, very craftily, just before the event, pulled the venue for unexplained reasons. So suddenly we are without a space. We tried to find other spaces, and we looked around, but they were scared of working with Shahidul. But then I used my jail contacts to negotiate using one of those spaces. And they say, for you, anything. So we had a space. But then the police leaned pressure on them, but we got everyone on the streets. And we were doing our own activism. And eventually, there was a statement made by the leading intellectuals of the country criticizing the government, what they did. And basically, the government had to back down. So we had the show. And this is Arundhati and me at the talk. What you'll notice at the back is that it was the 10th Chobi Mela, and the circle with a cross was our insignia. But that also is no more. It's resistance. And we had that all across the city. So subtly, we were also sending messages out. And a very interesting thing also happened. We got an emissary from the Prime Minister asking if not only that we could have the show, but that the event, but whether she could have 15 minutes with Arundhati. So we're turning this whole thing around. I mean, here we are, they're trying to close down the show, and now they realize that she's who she is, so perhaps the Prime Minister could have 15 minutes with her. Arundhati was crafty as well. I mean, not crafty is perhaps the wrong word, but she says, yeah, sure, I do sometimes meet Prime Ministers, and I'm willing to do that, but then I've come here on the invitation of Shahidul, so if the two of us come, we'd be happy to meet you. So now they back off, and we find another way to get out of that one. Anyway, next one. And of course, what happens generally is in events, people invite ministers, because that's how you get media attention. We never invite ministers generally. Yet, in our events, the media is there because of the quality of what we do. And I think while we looked at resistance, one of the things we shouldn't forget, the best way to resist is to produce bloody good work consistently. There's no better answer to whether it's an autocrat or anyone else. There is no backing out of that one. Yeah. And of course, the New York Times, then expresses this defiance. And how many exhibitions or festivals in Bangladesh would be talked about by the New York Times, by Washington Post? So that's the visibility that we also get. Yeah? And I'll now just show you a very few images in terms of what photography has been able to do. I had produced a body of work during the Shah period, during this military ruler, because there was a wedding that took place while there was a flood in the country. And I was documenting it, no one else spoke a word. But before doing that, I went to the minister's house and I took this photograph of these kids, the rich kids watching television. And we used it in our calendar. I was flying to, via Dubai, I was coming to Europe, and sitting across the aisle was this woman. And she said, "You don't recognize me, do you?" I didn't. She says, "I'm the fat girl in that picture." Yeah? Now, she was. I mean, of course, I didn't recognize her, but what had happened was she was very happy because her picture had been in this calendar. And then as she grew up, she realized that this calendar was actually critiquing her lifestyle and what she stood for. And she decided she would become a development worker. And while I was going to Europe, she was going via Dubai to Sierra Leone to join BRAC as a development worker. And she said that photograph made me decide I would lead a different life. Let's go on. And that's what I want to leave you with. While fear is contagious, while fear is there, I want to remind you that courage is contagious. And photographers can give you that courage. Thank you very much.